Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. Do you think that I can write 3 Blazor applications from scratch in just or below 30 minutes? More precisely, I would like to create a calculator, a URL shortener, and a weather application that makes some real calls to an API and displays that data to the user. And this in just 30 minutes. What do you think? Can I do that? Let's just see it. As there will be a lot of code in this video, and if you want to get access to it, don't forget that if you become a Code Wrinkles member on the Ambassador tier, you will get automatic access to the source code after each video. Make just sure to check the membership tab after you have joined to get more instructions on how you can access the source code. Now let's go to Visual Studio and let's start working on the app. So here I am in this very basic Blazor application template. It's a Blazor web app where we have these components and the layout and the pages, and we'll start right away under pages. I would like to add here a new Razor component that I will call, in this case, calculator, and that would be our component. Now there are a few things that we need to add here or to address. First of all, I want to make this routable and I want to have it under a page calculator. I will also love to have this in my nav menu, so I'll just go back here and let's for now just copy this and paste it here. And here we just need to do a few more changes, like here I want to navigate to our calculator. And last but not least, I want also the display to be here calculator, and that should be okay. So we should have the nav menu displaying this calculator right now. Obviously, I'll have a lot of buttons on this page that need to be clicked, and we need to perform something when we click those buttons. And this is a Blazor web app, so we need to make sure that we want to add a render mode interactive server. First, I would like to define some things that we will need for this calculator. First of all, we'll need a private string for the display value, and let's make it 0 by default. This will be displayed in the text box that displays, well, what the calculator is currently working on or what the current value is. One other thing that we'll need is to kind of like keep track of the current expression that we need to evaluate, and this one I think we can have as a string.empty, or well, just an empty string. Then I'll also need an array that will kind of like hold the different buttons that we have in our application. And here, those buttons, let me just, because Copilot here really gets in the way, let me go to a different line with this one. And here, basically, I want to have what we display on each button. And I want to have those elements in the order in which we have or we want to display the buttons on a regular calculator. So we'll start with the upper row 7, 8, 9, then it will be the division, then 4, 5, 6, then will be multiplication 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So this will be the buttons. The next thing that we'll need is a method that will be called when a button is clicked. We'll also need a method clear that will clear everything if we kind of like want to start from scratch with our calculations. And last but not least, we'll also need a method that will perform the calculation. So now we have the basic skeleton of our calculator. Now the idea is that when a button will be clicked, for instance this 7, then we will get this as an incoming parameter to this method, so we'll know that this is a 7. So in this case, we can just add a few logic based on what the current button is that the user has clicked. So let's start first by having here a simple if. And in this if, what I want to check is that if the button that was clicked was 0, or if it was this dot, which represents a decimal, then I don't want to actually do anything to the display value, because the display value should remain exactly the same. So in this if, I'll have this very, very simple check in which I'll say, okay, if the display value equals 0 and the value not equals dot, which means a decimal, then I would simply like to say that display value equals the value. So we update the current value that was selected. Otherwise, what we can do here is simply say that the display value would be plus equal to the value itself. So we will display everything in the text box. However, there is one last thing that we need to do here in this very simple method and update the current expression, because we will need the current expression to then evaluate the calculation at a later point. The clear method is very easy to implement, because when we want to clear everything, well, we just need to clean up some resources. Like here, this display value, we want to set it back to 0, and our current expression will set it back to the empty string. For the calculation itself, let's have here a try catch block first. We don't really want to catch any specific exception here, so we can get simply rid of that. And now the question is, how do we perform the calculation? As I want to get with this video over very fast, I will use something that it is probably not a best practice, but it gets the job done very fast. So we can have here, for instance, this result, And we can use this data table. A data table basically is just, well, a type that holds or that represents a table in memory of the application. Now, the reason why I want a new data table is because it has this compute method where you can give simply a current expression, and then we specify that we don't want to apply any type of filter here, like if you say compute and then string filter, and it will actually do the calculation for us, so we don't need to do anything else. Once we have the calculation, well, what we can do is update the display value, which would be the result to a string, and we'll also update the current expression to be equal to the display value. If for some reason the calculation was not able to be performed, we can then just simply set the display value to this error and we will get this message in our text box. Cool, so now that we are done with all the logic, let's go back and write some markup here. So the first thing that I would like to do here is add a div, and on this div I would want to make sure that, okay, well, we have a new bootstrap container. We would also like to add the margin on top of 5. We would also like to take advantage of all the bootstrap functionalities that we have out of the box here in this Blazor template. So I will also add this class row, and I will say that I want to have this justify content center. Now our calculator should be on the center of the page. So what I can do here is, okay, how wide do I want my calculator to be? So I'll add just a class of col4, which means that our calculator will be 4 columns wide. Then I would like to place the entire calculator into a card so that is displayed nicely. So we'll have this class card and the shadow. And now we can go one step further and simply use another div and define that this would be the card body itself. Let's now add a title to our card so that we know exactly that, hey, this is a calculator. No, just below the title, let's add another div. And in this case, I want it to be have this utility class margin bottom 3, so that it gets a little bit of space in compared to the bottom. And here is where we'll place our input, which is read only, because here is what we will display, like the display value. So we bind it to the value itself. Now let's create another div, and in this div we just want to place all the buttons that we need. So remember that we have that array of strings which holds kind of like the values of the buttons. So we can simply just use a for each here, and we can say that on click we just want to execute this button click and provide the button, which in this case will be a string, because that's what we have in the array. We'll then just need a button for the clear, and it would look something like this. And last but not least, also a button for the calculate, which will execute the calculate method when we click on it. And that's basically it. Now we should be actually good to go. So let me run the application and just hope that the demo gods are with me this time. So here's my application. I can now navigate to the calculator, and voila, we have our calculator. Let's say here that I want to have 7, and let's have it plus 2 equals 9. Cool, that went okay. Let's clear everything and let's start from scratch. Let's have 78 divided by 56 and equals to, it would be something like that one. And it seems that everything is just working fine. Let's just clear it again. And that's it. The first application is in the books, and we have implemented a very basic calculator in a Blazor application just in a matter of few minutes. Let's now move over and go to the second application, which is a full-fledged URL shortener. So back to Visual Studio, where I have created a new Blazor application. Once again, we have the default template and we want to build an URL shortener. Now for this one, I know for sure that we will need a database. So I will just simply go to the app settings.json and I would add my connection string. Now I have changed a little bit because I have already created a database, so I know that the database is already there. Now we can close this, and we know that we will work with Entity Framework Core, so it's time to install some NuGet packages. So let's go for Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and we will want to install the base package, let's call it that way. Click apply and accept. We will want to install the SQL Server package for Entity Framework Core, because that's what we will use. And last but not least, we'll need to install the tools. So let's click install and apply, and we should be okay with that. So let's just close this window. The next thing I want to do is to model my short URL here in my application. So I will add simply a new class, and I will call this class short URL. Pretty simple. Let's also provide some properties. We'll need an identifier, we'll need the original URL, and we'll need the short URL code that we will create ourselves just in a few minutes. Let's now create our application DB context. So a new class, application DB context. Let's make it inherit from the DB context. Let's also add the constructor, and hopefully Copilot will help me a little bit with this one, but it seems it won't. So I'll just add the constructor myself. This is the DB context options that I want to pass to my DB context. As for the DB sets, for now we'll just have a very simple DB set, which is a DB set of short URL that we will call short URLs. Now that we have the DB context, let's move over to our program.cs. Let's get the connection string, which is the default connection that we have generated earlier, and we'll then just add DB context with our application DB context, and we'll provide the connection string that we had defined earlier. So now that we have this in place, we can actually go to the package manager console and have here add migration initial. It will build and it should create a migration for me, and indeed the migration is here. So we can even close this file, don't need it. And then the one thing that I need to do is update database. Please make note that I have in this default project already selected this shortener project where my database actually is. So let's update the database and it should be okay. So we see that everything was executed correctly. So we should be good to go from this point of view. One last piece of gluing code that we will need would be a very simple service that will actually shorten our URLs and, well, get them from the database. Let's have here a new class. Let's call it shortening service and let's click here on add. In this service, we'll obviously need to insert or to have this application DB context. We'll just add a constructor in which we get the application DB context through dependency injection and assign it to the private field. Here, let's create first a private method that would generate our short URL code. And this will obviously here return a string. Now, the mechanism that I will use to generate a short code for the URL is really not bulletproof, but it will do the job. So first of all, we would have chars. This will contain basically all the chars, the characters that are eligible to be part of such a URL shortcode. I'll also use a string builder because I would like to compute a string in several different steps. And we also need a certain amount of randomness to actually pick some of the characters that we have in this chars array. So we'll create a new random. Then we'll just create here this very basic for loop, and we know that we need to iterate 8 times through the loop. So that's what we define here. And every time we iterate through it from the chars array, we just randomly pick one of the characters and we add it to the string builder. So once we've added all the characters, we can then just simply return the string builder and the toString, and it will return us the string. Now let's implement a very basic method that will shorten our URL and it will return the short version. First of all, we'll use the private method that we have just created to create a new short URL code. Then we'll create an instance of short URLs, or like a new object of short URL having the original URL and the short URL code that we have just created. Now that we have everything in place, we can just simply come here and say context short URLs add and the short URL. And last but not least, we can save all the changes in the database. And now we are ready to return the full URL with the short URL code that users can click and be redirected. For the redirect, we will need to actually pick from the database the long version of the URL if the shortcode is in the database. So therefore, we'll also need this very simple method get original URL async, in which we just get a short URL as a parameter, and then we could simply look for that URL in the database and then simply just also return it. Now this will be probably nullable, so we can have this task of string which is nullable, and that should be it. Before we move over to the front end, let's go back to this program.cs file, and here I just want to also add the shortening service that we have just created so that we can use it through dependency injection in our components. So let me go to these components, pages and home, and here is where we'll actually want to implement this. Now, since we'll also have here a form with a button, what I would like to do is say that for this page, I would like the render mode to be interactive server. Here we have the page title. Maybe we can change it to something like a URL shortener so that we know exactly what this is all about, and we will not need this anymore. What we'll need instead is a code block, so that's what we add here. Now here we'll need just 2 things. We need to have this original URL as a string and also the shortened URL. Oh, here we need to also add the code, obviously, because otherwise nothing will work as expected. And now we can inject our service. That's everything that we need. And now we can inject our shortening service that we have just created, and we'll have it available in our component. From a behavior perspective, the only thing that we'll need here is basically a method that will shorten a URL. So we'll set the shortened URL value to be what the shorten URL async method does in our service. Let's now create the markup. Let's first of all have a div. And in this div, once again, we want to use everything that we have in Bootstrap. So I'll have a container with a margin top. Then I want to place everything in a Bootstrap row that also justifies the content center. Let's now also define the width of our form. So we'll use the class and we'll use 6 columns for the width as we are inside the row. Let's also use the div and start with a card, similarly to what we have done in the calculator. And we can then move to our card body. So let me add this class, card body, and we should be good to go for this one. Let's also add here a title, similarly to what we have done also with the calculator. Let's add also here another div, and this div will contain basically the form. And for now, we'll just use a regular and very simple form with this bind, and we bind to the original URL. So we will not use the edit form component right now because it's a very simple scenario and I don't think that we actually need it right now. But what we will need instead is a button, and when we click on the button, we just want to call or invoke our shorten URL method. I would also like to have an alert that displays me the shortened URL so that I can simply just use it and share it and people can click on it. So we'll simply have here is an if string is null or empty of the shortened URL. So if we have a value in the shortened URL, well, we just basically want to display this div. And right now everything should be good to go from the component perspective, but there is really a very last thing that we need to add here. Now what we need is to identify when a request comes in, if that request is actually for a page of our application or if it is a request for a shortened URL. And one very good spot to perform this type of check is actually a custom middleware. So let me add here a new class. And we will call this class here simply shorten redirect middleware. Let's click this add. As this will be a middleware, we'll need the request delegate, then have obviously the constructor, which will get the request delegate through dependency injection. And we'll also need to implement this invoke async method that gets in the HTTP context. And we also want to get injected our shortening service that we have just created to check basically if we can find the short URL in our database. Once again, the approach I take here is not really bulletproof, and the only thing that I will do here is I'll have an if, and I will check in this if the path.length equals 8, and let's also define what the path actually is. And for this we have var path, and in the context we get the request path to string, and we want to make sure to trim the slash that we might have here. So now we have the path. It means that if the path is exactly 8 characters long, then it's most probably our short URL or a short URL. So we'll use the URL shortener service to get the original URL or to get the short URL from the database. And as this might be null, we can also have here a basic check and see that if string is null or empty, the original URL, or if it is not null or empty, then we simply just have this context response redirect and we just issue a redirect. If the path is not 8 characters long, then it's probably an application path. So in this case, we just call or invoke the next delegate and we should be good to go with this one. Obviously, to make this work, we also need to go back here to our program.cs, and after we have built the application, we also want to register our middleware and say app use middleware, and we specify this short URL redirect middleware. And now, once again, we should be there and we could run the application. So let's see if everything works as expected. So let me go to my Twitter, and I have this wonderful tweet or post on X, because it's known as X right now, about microservices and monoliths, and I would like to share it, but I would like to share it with a shortened URL. So I'll just copy it from here. Then I'll just use my form to provide this one, and let's click here on shorten URL. And we've seen that this URL has been shortened. Now let's just copy it. Theoretically, we can even click on it because it would open it in another window or tab because it has the target blank. But users might see it somewhere and might click on it, and it will lead them here. And as you can see, I was redirected to my X post here. So our URL shortener works. Now we are done with 2 out of 3 applications. There's still a little bit of time left, so let's move over to the next one, which will be a weather app. Back to Visual Studio for the final time in this video, where I have already created this template for the weather app, And once again, it's just a regular Blazor template that you get out of the box once you create a Blazor web app in .NET 8. For this one, if you want to follow along, notice that you'll also need an API key for openweathermap.org. So visit this website, create yourself an account and get an API key. You can create yourself an API key that you can use it for free, I think for a limit of 1000 requests per day, but I think that should cover it. As I have already played with this API, I know exactly what responses will I get back for the request that I will do, so I will just go straight ahead and create the classes to represent the response that I will get from the API. The first one is this main data, which will have basically just two properties, which will hold the temperature and the humidity. Then we'll also need another class that would represent the weather, and it's actually called like this in the API response. And this one will also have here a string, the description of the weather, and a string that represents the name of the icon that represents the current weather. And the main response object is the weather data. So let's add a new class here. Let's call it weather data, and that should do it. This will have three properties, one containing a main data, one containing an array of weather, and one containing the string of the name of that specific weather data. Now that we have all these objects, we can go on and create a new service, and this will be the weather service, and we'll just use this weather service to inject an HTTP client and to make calls to the API. Therefore, we will need a private read-only HTTP client that we will eventually get through dependency injection. And there are a few other things that we'll need here, like for instance the API key, and I will not place my API key right here. I will just place it in this file before I run the application, and obviously without you seeing this. And last but not least, let's also have a constant that will contain the base URL for this Open Weather Map API. Let's now create the constructor for the weather service, which will get an HTTP client, so we'll assign it to the private field. And now we can create the behavior that we'll need, and we'll just have a task that will return a weather data, which would be probably nullable. We'll call it get weather async. The whole concept here is that we get from the front end basically the string, the city, the location for which we want to get the weather, and we need to get the weather for that. Obviously, if there's a typo or something, we might receive a null back, so we might not have a real data to show. What we can do right away is just use the HTTP client and use this get async. We use this interpolated string to provide the base URL, and then here we'll build the query parameters that we need to send to the API in order to get the expected response back. First of all, it is this queue for the query, which we will pass in the city, then the app ID where we need to pass in the API key, and the units I want to use metric, but obviously you can replace it with imperial if you want to do it like that. As we might get errors, we want to have this if response is success status code. We just want to return the response and read that from JSON as a weather data, and then we'll obviously return that. Otherwise, we just simply return null back. Now let's move over to our program.cs class and actually register this service. That's really simple because the only thing that we'll need to do here is on the builder services, call this add HTTP client, and we provide the weather service because that is a service where we want to have the HTTP client injected. So now that we are done with this, we can go to our components, to our pages, and once again, we'll implement all the functionality here in this home page, but I would like to have my functionality a little bit more fancy. Like I want, for instance, a user to be able to simply just add a city, and that city should be saved to local storage, and the next time that the user visits the application, it should already see the weather data for that city displayed. Obviously, that user should have the option to add few other cities or to remove them if the user is not interested in those cities anymore. That's why we added this using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Protected Browser Storage, because to achieve this, we'll use the local storage. Now, obviously here we'll also have a button in this form, so we need interactivity. We'll also need to interact with the local storage. For that, we also need interactivity. So we'll have this render mode of interactive server. Last but not least, we need to inject two services, which is our weather service that we'll use to actually get the weather data, and this protected local storage service that we get directly from Blazor, which will allow us to actually work with our local storage. For the page title that will appear in the tab name, let's have here weather forecast, and let's also add here an H3 that will display on the page the fact that we will get some weather forecasts. Now, let me, as I always like to do, kind of like trying to figure out exactly what we will need from a code behind perspective. So first of all, we'll have a form in which users might provide a city, and we should get the weather data for that specific city. So that's why we need a string for that city. But then we also want to be able to actually persist the weather data, in our case probably to local storage, and that's for why I want to also a list of weather data, and we'll call this saved weather data, and we'll initialize it to a blank list. Now here there are a bunch of methods and functionalities that we will need to implement. First of all, we will have a method that would simply add a new city. Implementing this functionality is fairly straightforward. What we need here is a very simple if statement, and in this if, we just want to say that if this city is not null or empty, so if we have a valid string there, then we actually have a good shot that we can get something meaningful from the weather API. So what we can do is simply just use this API and call this get weather async with the city, and then we get the weather data back. Now this weather data might be null because it returns a nullable. And here what we can do is, well, do a very basic null check, and if the weather data is not null, there are two things that we want to do. First of all, we want to actually update this saved weather data, and we add this weather data to the list that we have here. But then we'll also need to update the local storage for that. So what we'll need to do here is just adding a new method that would be private async task save cities. So it's just as simple as that. And what we can do here is we can use the saved weather data, we can do a select, and we just are interested in the name of the weather data items that we have in the list, and then we create a list from that. Then we can use the protected local storage service to actually set saved cities, and we provide the list of strings, which are the cities. And since we are here working with local storage, we'll also need a method to remove something from the local storage. To do this, from the saved weather data, we want to get the item that corresponds to the name that was provided by the user when basically he or she clicked on the remove button. And then we can just simply await the save cities method that we actually had defined previously, because right now it will save the updated version of our weather data. Now coming back to our add city method, after we save the weather data, we also need actually save it in the city. So save it in the local storage so that the next time that the user navigates to this page, it already gets the cities displayed for which it wants to have the weather data. Now there is one other thing that we need to do is when we initially load the application and this component, we want to actually see or check if we have any saved data in the local storage so that we can load that. So therefore we have this method private async task, which is called load saved cities. The implementation is fairly simple. We just need to read all the cities from the saved cities in the local storage and place them in the saved cities that we have here. Now this call to get async will actually return a protected browser storage result. So it kind of like implements the result pattern. So what we can do here is have a very simple if and just specify that if saved cities is a success, then we want to do something. And the thing that we want to do is have a for each, and in this for each loop it will be very simple. We basically need to iterate through all the values that we have in the saved cities, and for them to actually get the weather data from or using our service. So we have this weather data, weather service, and get weather async. Once again, before we save this to our saved weather data, we need to check if it is null, because if it is null, we obviously don't want to do that. And now comes the trickiest part. So when the application loads and we want to access local storage, where or how exactly can we do that? Because this is a Blazor web app. And theoretically, it is pre-rendered on the server, even if we have this interactive server mode here enabled on the component level. Now, the thing is that to do this, we don't use the onInitialized async method, but instead we override the onAfterRenderAsync. And this method will be triggered after the component is actually rendered, which means that at that point we have access to the local storage. In onInitialize, for instance, we don't have access to the local storage. And as we know that it will go through this at least twice, if it is the first render, we just want to load the saved cities. And that's it. That's all the functionality that we need for this application. obviously there's a big piece missing, which is the markup. And this time I will cheat a little bit and I will just add the markup that I have already prepared for this application and we'll briefly walk through it. So first of all, like we did previously, we just have a container, but here in this case we just have an input group, which is the form, which is just a regular text box and a button that will call the add city method when the user clicks on it. And then we have another row in which we want to display all the saved data information. So we have here a card with a header, then we have an image source. And for the image source, remember that we know that for the weather we have an icon. And this is how we know exactly, or this is based on the documentation of the openweathermap.org API, where exactly those icons are saved and how we can access them. Now, obviously, then we have the card body, and in the card body, we just display some information that we have from the weather data, which is the name, the temperature, and then also the description for that. Also, we will have a button through which the user can remove that specific entry so that it gets permanently removed also from the local storage and it is not there anymore. So we should be good to go. Let's try to run this again and hopefully we will not have any exceptions, although I think we'll have if we run the application, because there is one thing to do that I forgot, and that is to add my API key to my service. And I'm sure that you didn't see it, but right now I have added my API key, so let's run the application again. And this time, I hope that everything will work as expected. So obviously, as is the first time that we run this application, we don't really have any city. So let's specify the city where I am living. It's Timișoara. So we can edit and, oh, okay, we see that it's temperature 7.1 and it's misty. That's cool. Okay, let's check another location. Let's see how's the weather in Seattle right now. So let me get weather in Seattle, and in Seattle it's actually warmer than in Timișoara, which is kind of like nice. Let's try something else. Let's say Dubai. Well, how's the weather in Dubai right now? Well, it's kind of like temperature 29. Oh my god, 29. That's a huge difference between this one. Now, if we reload the application, we see that we actually don't get to see the weather. So let me check one thing that I think I forgot. And this is when we actually want to load the cities, there is one thing that we need to do. And this thing is to call actually state has changed, because otherwise Blazor will not re-render this with the new information. And right now, if we run the application again and the application opens, and you can see that right now we can read it and we can refresh it. So no matter if we close the application again, if we run it again, we will always see this type of information, because these cities are saved in local storage. For instance, if we remove them from local storage, then they are simply removed. So if I do a force refresh here, we see that Dubai is not there anymore. Then I can also remove this one. And if I do a refresh, you can see that it's still there. We can just play around. Let's add, I don't know, Munich, for instance. Let's see how's the weather in Munich. And it's also 7.8 degrees, so almost 8, and it's a clear sky. Okay, so this was close, but I think I managed to write all these 3 applications in just 30 minutes, because we had also a lot of time that we have spent showing the running applications, like doing the demos. So I think that overall we can see how actually easy it is to get started or to write applications and have something to show with Blazor. So it's not that you can do it only with other frameworks. Blazor is totally fine and able to do just that. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button so that you can make it easier for others to discover here on YouTube, and they might also find it more useful. And if you're for the first time here, also hit the subscribe button and press the notification bell so that you are always notified when there's something new happening on the Code Wrinkles channel. If you have anything to say or just want to add something or just get in touch with me, don't be shy and head over to the comment section and leave a comment, and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.